Before America learned what real strength looked like, Ellen DeGeneres planned to ambush Clint Eastwood with divisive questions and hostile audience. This is the story of how her carefully orchestrated attack became her own destruction. Ellen had set the trap perfectly. Hostile questions, a pre-trained audience, and topics designed to corner Clint. She would portray him as an outdated relic. But what Ellen didn't know was this: real cowboys don't fall into ambushes, they wait in them. On a cool morning in Carmel by the Sea, Clint Eastwood received an email that would change everything. The invitation to appear on the Ellen DeGeneres show seemed innocent enough on the surface, but something about the proposed topic, the division of American values, made him pause. His assistant Jake, a former Marine with sharp instincts, immediately sensed trouble. "Ellen's the type to stick the knife behind the laugh," Jake warned, studying the email more carefully. The show's producers had been unusually specific about the discussion topics, focusing heavily on generational conflicts and changing social values. It felt less like an interview request and more like a setup. Clint sat in his leather chair, sunlight streaming through the windows of his home office, surrounded by old scripts, history books, and a silver sheriff's badge his father had given him decades ago. The badge served as a constant reminder that justice wasn't just a slogan, but a duty. After a long moment of consideration, he made his decision. "If they want to mock what's right," he told Jake, "let's remind them it's not up for debate." Behind the scenes at Ellen's Burbank studio, the preparation was unlike anything they had done for a typical celebrity interview. The show's producers had spent weeks crafting what they believed would be the perfect takedown of traditional American values, using Clint as their unwitting symbol of everything they felt the country needed to move beyond. Ellen herself had been briefing extensively with her writing team, developing pointed questions designed to make Clint appear out of touch with modern America. The audience had been carefully selected and coached on when to react, creating an atmosphere that would make any defense of traditional values seem antiquated and irrelevant. "We need tension to boost ratings," Ellen told her executive producer during their final strategy meeting. "The audience wants to see old Hollywood put in its place. Clint Eastwood is perfect. He represents everything that needs to change." The social media team had already prepared hashtags and talking points for the post-show buzz. Entertainment blogs had been given advance notice about the cultural showdown that was about to unfold. Everything was orchestrated to create a viral moment that would position Ellen as the voice of progressive America taking on the outdated establishment. By the time Clint arrived in Burbank, social media was already buzzing about the upcoming culture clash. But while Ellen's team was celebrating their elaborate trap, Clint wasn't worried or rehearsing talking points. He simply sat quietly on the plane, certain that truth doesn't need permission to be heard. At the studio, a stylist offered Clint modern jackets to update his look, but he politely refused, keeping his worn leather jacket. Hidden inside his lapel was the sheriff's badge, not for show, but for himself, a reminder of the values he'd sworn to uphold. Meanwhile, Ellen prepared her attack cards, telling her producer she wanted maximum tension to boost ratings. When Clint walked onto the stage, he moved with the same steady pace that had defined his Western films for decades. His experienced eyes immediately noticed that Ellen's wide smile didn't reach her calculating gaze. The audience had been primed for confrontation, their energy focused and hostile, rather than the usual warm welcome guests typically received. Ellen started with seemingly friendly comments, but Clint could feel the trap being set with each word. The questions began innocently enough before taking a sharp turn toward judgment. "Clint, do you ever feel out of step with where America's headed?" she asked, her tone carrying a subtle condescension that suggested the answer was obvious. Clint's response was calm but pointed. "America doesn't move in one direction. It moves where people with backbone lead it." The conversation continued with polite but mounting tension. Ellen pressed harder, suggesting that Clint was clinging to a past that America had outgrown. The audience, following their cues, murmured agreement with Ellen's progressive talking points. After a meaningful pause, Clint answered with devastating simplicity, "Some things aren't meant to be outgrown. They're meant to be upheld." The audience fell silent, sensing a shift in the room's mood that their coaching hadn't prepared them for. Ellen, feeling the momentum slipping, pressed harder. She asked if America still needed cowboys and sheriffs, dismissing them as mythology from a bygone era. Clint leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had lived through decades of American history. When the law turns into a joke, sometimes the only thing between chaos and order is a man who still believes it matters. The silence that followed was thick and meaningful. Ellen tried to brush off the seriousness of his response, forcing a laugh. "Passion without progress is just stubbornness," she said, but her confidence was beginning to waver. Clint's reply was quiet but devastating. "Progress doesn't mean abandoning your soul." His words seemed to change the atmosphere in the room completely. Ellen, sensing she was losing control of her own show, grew more aggressive, questioning Clint's compassion and suggesting he refused to see how the world had changed. Ellen's increasingly desperate attacks only served to expose the hollowness of her position. When she suggested that Clint lacked compassion for refusing to embrace change, his response hit like a precision strike. Compassion without truth is just another kind of lie. Backstage, the production team was in crisis mode. A producer muttered anxiously, "He's flipping the room," while a young technician wondered aloud why Clint sounded more honest than their usual guests. The carefully orchestrated ambush was turning into something none of them had planned for, a genuine moment of truth on live television. Ellen tried to recover, suggesting it was time to let the next generation lead America. But Clint's simple reply cut through her talking points like a blade. The next generation needs roots, not just wings. A murmur spread through the audience as the mood in the studio shifted dramatically. The pre-planned responses Ellen had counted on were replaced by genuine contemplation. Audience members who had come expecting to witness the takedown of outdated values instead found themselves questioning their own assumptions. Ellen could feel her control slipping away with each exchange. Her questions, which had seemed so clever during preparation, now sounded shallow and rehearsed compared to Clint's authentic responses. The man she had intended to portray as out of touch was demonstrating a wisdom that resonated even with her carefully selected progressive audience. Studio staff and audience members began quietly acknowledging the power of Clint's words. The usual narrative that Ellen had built her career on was losing its grip in real time. Her attack wasn't just failing, it was backfiring spectacularly. When the show cut to commercial, the backstage atmosphere was unlike anything the crew had experienced. Instead of the usual laughter and casual chatter, there was a heavy silence. A senior producer frantically made calls, trying to pivot the show's direction, but it was too late. The damage to Ellen's carefully crafted image was already done. Jake, watching from the green room, told Clint he was trending online, but Clint simply adjusted his sheriff's badge and said, "It's not about trending, it's about standing." The audience that had been coached to mock traditional values was now sitting in respectful silence, many appearing to reconsider their own positions. Ellen's attempt to humiliate Clint had instead revealed the strength and dignity of the values she had tried to attack. The hunter had become the hunted, and everyone in the studio could feel it. As the show returned from commercial break, Ellen made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative she had lost. Her voice carried a forced brightness that couldn't mask her growing desperation. "Clint, surely you understand that America needs to evolve beyond these old-fashioned ideas about right and wrong." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Ellen seemed to believe she had finally cornered him with what she saw as an unanswerable progressive talking point. But Clint had been waiting for this moment, the moment when his opponent would overplay their hand completely. He leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades learning when words mattered most. "Ellen, you keep talking about evolution like it means throwing away everything that worked for the people who built this country." The audience was completely still now, hanging on every word. Ellen's smile began to falter as she realized she was no longer controlling the conversation. "Real evolution," Clint continued, "doesn't mean forgetting where you came from. It means taking the best of what your ancestors gave you and building something even better on that foundation. He paused, letting his words sink in. What you're describing isn't evolution. It's just fashionable destruction. Ellen tried to interrupt, but Clint wasn't finished. You invited me here to represent some outdated way of thinking, didn't you? To be your symbol of everything America needs to move past? His eyes found hers directly. But here's what you didn't count on. The values you're trying to tear down aren't museum pieces. They're the foundation everything else stands on. The studio was now completely silent. Even the production crew had stopped moving, transfixed by what was unfolding. Ellen opened her mouth to respond, but for perhaps the first time in her talk show career, she found herself speechless. Clint stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and dignified. You want to know what real progress looks like? It's not abandoning honor for convenience or trading integrity for popularity. It's holding on to what matters while you figure out what comes next. He looked directly into the camera, speaking not to Ellen, but to the millions of Americans watching at home. And what matters is simple: keeping your word, protecting what you love, and standing up for what's right even when it's not easy. The silence that followed was absolute. Ellen's carefully planned ambush had not only failed, it had given Clint the perfect platform to remind America of everything she had tried to make them forget. The moment the show ended, the internet exploded with a force that no one at Ellen's studio had anticipated. Within minutes, clips of Clint's responses were being shared across every social media platform, viewed by millions of people who were hungry for the kind of authentic leadership they had just witnessed. The hashtag #Clint's Right began trending within the first hour, followed quickly by #Real Values and #Ellen Exposed. Comments poured in from across the political spectrum, with even longtime liberals admitting that Clint's words had resonated with something they didn't realize they had been missing. "This is what real strength looks like," wrote one user whose comment received over 100,000 likes. Not shouting, not attacking, just standing firm on principles. Entertainment news outlets scrambled to cover what many were calling the most significant talk show moment in decades. Conservative media hailed it as a victory for traditional American values, while even liberal commentators found it difficult to criticize Clint's dignified performance. Behind the scenes at Ellen's show, the reaction was one of barely controlled panic. The carefully planned ambush had not only failed, but had created a public relations nightmare that threatened to undermine everything Ellen had built. Sponsors began making nervous phone calls, and the show's ratings team watched in horror as social media sentiment turned decisively against their host. Ellen herself tried damage control with a series of social media posts claiming the interview had been taken out of context, but the internet wasn't buying it. Video clips showing her condescending tone and obvious attempts to embarrass Clint only made her look worse in comparison to his calm dignity. The most devastating blow came when several major advertisers announced they were re-evaluating their relationship with the show. In Hollywood speak, this was the beginning of the end. Ellen's attempt to boost ratings by attacking traditional values had instead exposed the hollowness of her own platform. News channels across the country debated whether America was ready for old values to make a comeback. In diners, libraries, and online forums, people shared the moment and their own stories of standing for what they believe, regardless of social pressure. Within a week, 3 major sponsors had pulled their advertising from Ellen's show entirely. The ratings for the Clint Eastwood episode became the highest of the season, but for all the wrong reasons from Ellen's perspective. People weren't tuning in to support her. They were coming to see the moment when her carefully constructed progressive persona had been quietly dismantled by a man who simply refused to apologize for believing in something bigger than himself. Ellen's team later issued a carefully worded apology, but the damage was irreversible. The show that had once been a dominant force in daytime television began a steady decline that would eventually lead to its cancellation. What Ellen had intended as a ratings-boosting takedown of outdated values instead became the beginning of her own downfall. The most telling aspect of the aftermath was how it revealed the disconnect between Hollywood's elite and the American people they claimed to represent. Ellen's assumption that audiences would automatically side with her progressive talking points proved catastrophically wrong. Instead, millions of viewers found themselves nodding along with Clint's defense of traditional values. Clint, true to his character, turned down most interview requests that followed. When pressed by one persistent reporter about his appearance on Ellen's show, he simply said, "I said what needed saying." Actions speak louder than explanations. The interview became a cultural touchstone, referenced in political speeches, shared in family discussions, and studied in communications classes as an example of how authentic conviction can overcome even the most carefully planned attack. It reminded Americans that there was still value in the old ways of thinking about honor, duty, and integrity. Perhaps most significantly, the incident sparked a broader conversation about media bias and the responsibility of talk show hosts to treat their guests with basic respect. Several other daytime shows quietly revised their booking practices, realizing that the public was growing tired of ambush-style interviews designed more for viral moments than genuine conversation. Ellen's career never fully recovered from that single interview. While she continued hosting for a while longer, the respect and trust she had built with audiences over decades was shattered in the span of one disastrous show. She had revealed herself to be exactly what Clint had quietly suggested, someone more interested in tearing down than building up. The final irony was that Ellen's attempt to portray Clint as out of touch with modern America had instead proven how desperately in touch he remained with the values that truly mattered to most Americans. In a world that increasingly valued noise over substance and outrage over understanding, Clint Eastwood had shown that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that refuses to shout. His quiet strength had reminded millions of Americans that standing for what's right never goes out of style. In an era that rewards division and conflict, he had demonstrated that real strength isn't about how loudly you speak, but how firmly you stand by your beliefs. The lesson was clear. When you try to ambush a legend, you better make sure you don't end up being the one who gets destroyed. Have you ever stood firm in your beliefs when everyone around you disagreed? Share your story in the comments below.
Don't forget to hit the like button if you like the video and subscribe if you want videos like this to come. See you in the next story.